All right, okay, let me get started now. All right, so hi everyone. Welcome to the SIG Cloud Provider intro. I'm Andrew. I'm a software engineer at DigitalOcean and one of the co-chairs of the SIG. So Jago, who works at Google, couldn't make it today, unfortunately, and so you're stuck with me today. All right, so the agenda, which I'm actually hoping to get through in like 20-ish minutes so that we have more time in the end for questions and discussions, is I'm going to go over kind of the history and background of how the SIG was originally formed. And then I want to talk about code ownership in terms of like what code does the SIG actually own and maintain. And then I want to talk about our current subprojects and working groups that we're involved in and kind of the future subprojects and working groups that we want to be involved in. And then I want to talk about project governance that our SIG is kind of responsible for in the kind of the larger Kubernetes project. And then kind of also want to talk about the challenges that our SIG is facing today. And then, yeah, like I said, I want to leave about 10 to 15 minutes for questions and discussions. All right, so history and background. So interestingly, our SIG is fairly new to the community. Unlike some of the other SIGs that have been around for a few years now, SIG Cloud Provider was formed around July. And the SIG was formed to take ownership of sort of the cloud provider components of Kubernetes that before that didn't really have well-defined owners for. So if we go back to Kubernetes in 2016, Kubernetes was mainly developed in the main tree k/io/Kubernetes, and today it's technically still mostly developed in the main tree. And if you wanted to add a new cloud provider into the Kubernetes project, you would open a PR which included an implementation of kind of all the interfaces we defined for a cloud provider, and then you would vendor in any libraries that you had for your cloud provider, and then you would kind of put it all in the main tree. And so as long as you like implement all those cloud provider interfaces, then kind of the various components in Kubernetes, the controller manager, the kubelet, and the API server, all kind of knew how to call out to your cloud provider via that interface, and then Kubernetes would officially support your cloud provider. And so as the project grew and more cloud providers wanted to natively support Kubernetes, we realized that kind of growing this list of providers in tree wouldn't scale well. And the reasons, I'll talk about the reasons later, but it didn't scale well. So at the time, with about like 6 or 7 providers, we were already realizing that like this model that we're kind of following was really difficult to implement. And so Tim Hawken had proposed a new idea in a pull request, which was essentially to build this out-of-tree controller manager that could be developed per cloud provider. And then we can gradually work to migrate all the existing in-tree providers into those out-of-tree cloud providers. So essentially, like, this is the model we have today, where all the core components of Kubernetes, the kubelet, the API server, controller manager, they all have the cloud, like the cloud providers, like APIs and libraries, like compiled into the component. So each component knows how to call out to their respective cloud providers. And the model that we wanted going forward was that all the core pieces of Kubernetes, the kubelet, the API server, the controller manager, were cloud provider agnostic, and that only this one piece called the cloud controller manager would understand how to call out to the cloud provider. And so in 2016, we formed the Cloud Provider Working Group, which sole goal was to build that Cloud Controller Manager component. And so essentially, what we're trying to do here is pick out, like, identify all the controllers in the project that were like cloud specific that talk to the cloud provider, and then we wanted to kind of port those over into this new component called the Cloud Controller Manager. And so instead of having all the providers being pushed into that main tree k/io/Kubernetes and and having all the components compile all those providers into a single binary, what we wanted was this out-of-tree model where each provider is given their own repositories, and then the community would provide kind of the tooling and the infrastructure to allow them to build these like cloud controller components themselves. And so this also meant that they'd be responsible for managing releases and all those things separate from that main tree. So once we actually built the Cloud Control Manager, which like I don't think actually building it took that long, but once we actually built it, we realized that like it wasn't enough just to build this thing. We now had to worry about how do we actually migrate users from the Kube Controller Manager to the Cloud Controller Manager. We also have to worry about cloud provider storage, which is interesting because there's like a separate provider for the storage interface, which I'm going to talk about later. And we also had to like plan out how to actually move the existing providers that were in the main tree to their own providers out of tree. And so like there was a lot of things we hadn't considered when we wanted to form this working group. And we realized that there's a lot of like long-term initiatives for this, for like that cloud provider component of the project that needed to be addressed. And so when we think about like why do we even want to go out of tree in the first place, kind of these are the main motivations, which are when we release a version of Kubernetes, we want the releases to be we want cleaner releases where the changelog isn't all a bunch of bug fixes from a specific provider. Especially like if you run a large deployment on cloud provider A, like you don't want to have like cloud provider B, C, and D like being in your changelog. So we want to kind of make Kubernetes, the Kubernetes core, kind of its own thing. And we also wanted to make sure that all the components are only installing what we needed. So like if we were to build in all the providers into the main tree, then every distribution of the kubelet or whatever would have to compile in all those dependencies. And so we wanted to get rid of that, which also meant that we would have smaller binary sizes. And so Walter, who is a member of the SIG, ran an experiment a few weeks back and found that by removing all the cloud provider dependencies, we'd be cutting down about like 30 megabytes on every binary. And so like that seems like a pretty big win. And lastly, we wanted faster development cycle of each provider so that if providers want to fix any critical bugs, they wouldn't have to go through like cherry picking commits through the main tree. They can kind of develop that on their own. And so, yeah, out of these concerns, we form the SIG, which acts as that central group for developing the Kubernetes project in a way that ensures all those providers are kind of have common privileges and responsibilities in the ecosystem. And this was done by ensuring that we're actually architecting Kubernetes to be provider agnostic. And we're also ensuring that we're setting kind of clear technical requirements for new providers, which I'm going to talk more about later. All right, so code ownership. So if you go to kits.io/community, there's a YAML file called sigs.yaml that kind of outlines like all the code that a SIG owns. So this is the most recent screenshot of the SIG cloud provider part of that file, which kind of just outlines like all the controllers and all the like subprojects that we have. And you'll notice that we also have like some of the existing provider SIGs under our SIG. And so this is kind of a transitional thing, which I'm also going to talk about later. So yeah, in the future, when we have all the cloud providers broken out into their own modules or repos, those providers, well, the goal that we're trying to get at is that those providers would fall under the ownership of one SIG, which is our SIG. And at the current rate of how many providers we would have to support, we would probably end up with, like if we went with the current model where like every provider gets a SIG, we'd probably end up with more like cloud provider SIGs than we do like the core Kubernetes SIGs. And so yeah, like this is the main kind of motivation around like why we're trying to shift towards a model where like providers are falling under one single SIG instead of each provider getting their own SIG. And in my deep dive tomorrow, I'm going to talk more about our plan for that going forward. So subprojects and working groups. If you going back to the slide, yeah, like we have various controllers and the cloud provider interface that we own, but I wanted to highlight specifically the cloud provider extraction subproject. And so this subproject is dealing with specifically how to remove existing cloud providers in the main Kubernetes tree. So AWS, GCP, VMware, OpenStack, trying to get those providers into their own out-of-tree repos. And the reason why this kind of needs its own subproject is that it's actually getting to the out-of-tree model when you're already in tree is really difficult because you have to consider like migration paths and all the various dependency management that has to happen when you make that transition. And so we have a dedicated subproject to really address that migration path going forward. And so this is led by Nishi and Walter from AWS and Google. And so to kind of dig deeper into what this subproject is doing, it's essentially taking those providers that I just mentioned that are in tree. So they live in k/io/kubernetes/package/cloud provider/providers. And what we're trying to do is to first move them into the Kubernetes staging directory. And what this allows us to do is then have like a automatic publish system that publishes everything we have in the staging directory to the actual out-of-tree providers. And so like the main motivation around this is that we can then like compile the kube controller manager and the cloud controller manager both from in-tree in the staging directory and both out-of-tree in the respective out-of-tree repos. And if you're familiar with kind of this model, we do this with a lot of the other common repositories in Kubernetes, such as client Go, API machinery, and so on. And so the end goal, like once we know that all the in-tree providers are no longer using that in-tree code, then we can kind of delete it, and then the end goal would just be this, where every provider just has like their own repo in k/io. Yeah.
Why did you choose k/io?
Yeah, so that's a good question.
Why did you choose k/io, which is a top-level domain?
Yeah, I don't think the mic went on, so I'll just repeat it. So the question was, why didn't we choose Kubernetes SIGs instead of why did we choose Kubernetes instead of Kubernetes SIGs? And the main reason actually is because I don't remember like the history behind this, but I think SIG architecture decided at one point like, oh, we'll just like throw it in the main Kubernetes org, and then once that was created, we were stuck with it. So like, this is like that's purely why. I think there was a mailing thread a bit back about like, oh, we should do Kubernetes SIGs, and there was a few weeks of discussion like, okay, like if existing providers are in the main Kubernetes org, do we still want to push like new providers into Kubernetes SIGs? And there was kind of pushback around like we already have this divergence of like in-tree and out-of-tree providers, and then we don't want to create a second level of divergence where we have like the out-of-tree Kubernetes providers and the out-of-tree Kubernetes SIGs providers. And so we kind of just like came to consensus on sticking with the main Kubernetes org.
Yeah, right. But why didn't you move out the in-tree cloud providers that are now directly into SIGs, k/io, along with all the other new out-of-tree?
Yeah, and it's because those repos, like the repos in the main Kubernetes org, like were created prior to us figuring out what that migration would look like.
Okay.
And I don't have an answer to why that was the case. Like when we picked this project up, someone we don't know who like had created these repos already, probably like around 2017, and the goal was like, oh, we're gonna like move all this code entry to these repos, but like no one actually like did the work, and then we were stuck with these repos, and then we decided like, okay, we're just gonna work with the main tree or the main Kubernetes org.
Yeah, right. But this is, so what's the stability status we've declared for these repos?
The stability status, like in terms of like API guarantees?
Like for alpha, beta, GA?
Yeah, so I don't think any of these repos have code that is considered like beta or stable. We're currently at a point where like we just want people to put their code there. But I think long-term wise, we want providers to like define that themselves. yeah, that's kind of
yeah. I'm gonna try to catch up with that discussion and see.
Yeah, let's chat later. Yeah.
Still be moved before stable.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So pretty much what I just described, like going from in tree to staging to out of tree, that's what the extraction subproject is doing right now. And I'm going to talk more about like the actual like steps to get here in the deep dive tomorrow. Okay. So in terms of working groups, like right now our SIG isn't actually involved in any working groups, but there is discussions around like forming the LTS working group, which is kind of focused around like exploring if Kubernetes should provide like a long-term support distribution for our users. And so this is a working group that our SIG is looking to be involved in, because we definitely think like the cloud providers as like pluggable modules in Kubernetes is going to be important to how we like define what long-term support is going to look like. All right, so governance. So this is actually a role in the SIG that I think is really important for the long-term health of the project. As more cloud providers want to support Kubernetes natively on their platforms, it's really important for us to think about like how to give those providers the freedom to build that native support for Kubernetes that they want, and also giving them a voice in our community. And so our SIG had quite a few discussions around like how to do this effectively, and the model that we've landed on so far, which I kind of touched on earlier, was that we would treat cloud providers as subprojects. And so the reason we landed on this model was that we're finding that, like I said before, like having a SIG per cloud provider was not sustainable. And so there would be just as many SIGs, like per cloud provider SIGs that we do like the core Kubernetes SIGs, right? And so this is kind of like what we think is sustainable going forward. And to be honest, like we have to be honest and think that like having a SIG is really nice, because you get to like you're given a platform to talk to contributors. You're given a chance to like do SIG intros and deep dives at conferences. And so like we're kind of in this place where we have to find a good middle ground for what we think is a good model for providers. And if I have to be honest again, like I don't think we don't have all the questions answered right now. And we're like our SIG is currently trying to figure out like what the end goal looks like and what we want to like what we think is a good model for new cloud providers in Kubernetes. But yeah, like as of today, what we're going forward with is cloud providers as subprojects. And so like kind of going on top of that, we are also, as a SIG, trying to set some technical requirements for new cloud providers that want to join the Kubernetes ecosystem, because we definitely want to be an open community, and we want to give every cloud provider kind of equal privileges in our ecosystem. But then we also want to set some sort of standard so that I can't set up a bunch of servers in my basement and call it a Kubernetes cloud provider. So we want to make sure that like we have some sort of technical requirements for cloud providers. And on top of that, that we're ensuring that cloud providers are actually contributing back into the ecosystem, and there's like a good back and forth between the community and the cloud providers. And so like this is like the current list of requirements that we set for new cloud providers if they want a repo in the Kubernetes org to build their cloud providers. All right, so SIG challenges. So at a kind of really high level, challenges we have is trying to build APIs for every cloud provider. So every cloud provider does nodes, load balancers, and whatnot differently. And so trying to build an interface and a stable API that is going to satisfy every cloud provider is going to be impossible. But we're trying to do our best in terms of like making sure that the right abstractions are in place so that making sure the right abstractions are in place so that we're trying to satisfy as many cloud providers in this ecosystem as possible. Migrations are really slow. So we're trying to converge to this new out-of-tree model, but we're finding that there's a lot of technical debt in the project that makes doing this difficult. And on top of that, like we're trying to change the way production clusters are configured, and no one likes touching production. So like not only do we have to actually do the work to get this migration going, but we have to now convince users to actually like change the clusters, and we need to give enough releases to actually deprecate features and whatnot. So a lot of times we have our hands tied just because we need to give users enough time to adapt to these new configurations that we have. And also, yeah, project governance. Like I said just a moment ago, trying to find a SIG model that accommodates for all the cloud providers in our ecosystem is really hard. And so, you know, we have a lot of discussions around this, and trying to like converge to a model that we think is going to be really good is going to take some time. So in my deep dive tomorrow, I'm going to talk about more about like what those abstractions are, and like so for nodes, load balancers, and all those things, like what abstractions and APIs are we actually building in Kubernetes? What do the actual controllers that I talked about earlier, like what do they actually do in your clusters? The migration from the Kube Controller Manager to the Cloud Controller Manager, what's that going to look like? And yeah, I'm going to definitely talk more about like how we're going to actually get from case.io/Kubernetes to case.io/cloud provider/whatever. And then, yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about like the tech that we have in Kubernetes around cloud providers. All right, so that's all I had. That was about 20 minutes, so we have about 15 minutes just for questions and discussions around the SIG. Any questions? All right.
That's good. Yeah, cool. Now we don't have to repeat everything again. Okay, so first of all, thanks for this presentation. And being a SIG lead for this, it's not glamorous.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work. We've done this for a long time already. So yeah, the question about like SIGs versus case.io was one, but why I'm asking is basically because we have the cluster API has the same problem.
Yeah.
And we're trying to I was wondering, have there been any discussions with the cluster API working group? Can we somehow merge them in some way? Like if you have this kind of, now we call them cloud provider. I don't know if distribution is the right word, but that is also like one take on it. So what the CCM basically does right now is these controllers. What the cluster API is also a different set of controllers. And while they might be in different binaries, is maybe a way to. So there's also this cluster bundles thing that the cluster lifecycle is looking at, especially Justin and them. Can we somehow make this cloud, everything cloud thing, some standardized cluster bundle add-on repo-like thing? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's not clear where we're gonna go right now.
Yeah.
But
So this is where I wish Jago was here, because like he has some pretty strong opinions around like that topic. But I think the reason why we decided to name the repos like cloud provider, whatever, is because we want it to be like not just the CCM built into the repo, but like in the future, whatever else that is applicable to the cloud provider. I think the timing in terms of cluster API was kind of bad because like we don't have all the code moved there, but the cluster API is already like building all the providers and whatnot. So like we have those two separate repos, but like I would love to see in the future where we just like consolidate the cluster API for the provider, the CCM, the CSI, all that stuff, just like in a single repo or something.
Yeah, right. I would also kind of like that.
Yeah.
If we had like one repo under Kubernetes SIGs that is SIGs case.io cloud provider or cluster bundle GCP or like whatever, and then hosting everything cluster API in one or three different binaries, I don't know, then one for the CCM and maybe some custom GCP certificates control that's existed in the main repo sometime. I don't know where that is now.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Similar code.
Yeah. And yeah, in terms of like coordinating with the cluster API working group, we did have a few discussions around like I know Chris Nova gave kind of like a introduction to our SIG on like what they're doing, but like I think as of now there hasn't been too many discussions like between us because I think like we're just working on two different things right now. But I do see like in the near future us having to like converge to a single point.
Yeah.
I don't know what that is yet.
Yeah.
I have no objection.
But an initial thought for why the cloud providers got moved out of tree is to allow them to have independent release cycles and not tie them together. So you fix a bug in one and the whole thing has to be retested. Really, the cluster API is a potentially different thing that you'd like to keep independent. So bundling them as a package where you get all or none, my initial impression is I'm skeptical. But that doesn't mean we can't put them under a common tree in the repo, but having them be one unified atomic thing, just my initial reaction is that would be a bad idea.
I think it's more a question of packaging right now. Binaries will be independent anyway. Having a single repo, we actually been through this exercise with SIG VMware. We started working on the CSI plugin. We've been using the same repo as Cloud Provider. For now, it's fine because we're early in the development cycle. But once we get to a point where we have stable releases, it's going to be problematic to tag different releases for two different things happening in the same repo. There's always strategy to do that, but it's not straightforward as it's supposed to be. I think it's more a question of packaging. I think I raised this a few times during the meetings. What will be the best way to package this? And Tim Hawking had a long conversation during one of the SIG Cloud Provider meeting. What is Kubernetes? Is it a distribution? Is it should be treated as a kernel? Should be treated as a distribution? We don't know yet. I think it makes sense from a user perspective. What would be, if I'm using a platform, what will be the best way to run Kubernetes on that specific platform? Which means should I run this Kubernetes piece of Kubernetes core, the CSI plugin that comes with it, the cloud provider that comes with it, the cluster API provider comes with it. How do I, take this package and use it to run it on a specific platform? Which I believe is still open question right now.
Yeah, right. Very valid points. So yeah, CSI driver is a good third example of this. Like my worry is like, or let's say it like this: if you're hosting your code on GitHub / your company name, like VMware or whatever, IBM, then you can have like, I don't care if you have 15 different repos for things, like for every binary or whatever, and then have something that aggregates the distribution, if you like, saying we're releasing our September 18 release, which has these different things and this Kubernetes version, and all packages it all together. But I'm just worrying that if we're creating, like now we have already 3 different, we have the CCM, we have the cluster API, we have the CSI, we have like CRI as well. If we CNI and all, like, let's say we actually have a cloud provider that implements all these 5 to 10 in the future interfaces. I'm worried that we're creating 5 or 10 repos per provider, either in core or in SIG's case.io, when there's like technically it can be done in a repo, and we can like, it can also be this package repo in SIG's case.io, for example, could aggregate from multiple sources as well, and be this. I would like it. Yeah, I remember the distributions versus kernel thing. We had great discussions about a year ago about that, and offline as well. So I think it would make sense to have like what's in case.io is really the kernel and keep it like that, and then extend in SIGs. Or, I mean, for my part, I would.
What is the downside? Who gets hurt? And users get hurt, developers get hurt. Both of them, or how do they get hurt? Two repos instead of one.
In the Kubernetes, so like, I don't know if I want to see 1,000 different like repos in the core.
Let's say there's 5 Who gets hurt and how?
Well, the multiple, we see the Kubernetes ecosystem exponentially growing. And if we keep putting distribution kind of stuff in case.io, I feel that it's going to be hard to distinguish what is provider specific and what is actually community created content, or like kernel related content. So that's why I would like to see some kind of distinction, and why I brought it up. From my like personal view, it would be fine with cloud.case.io or whatever. And there, under that, like github.com/Kubernetes Cloud, we could have as many, like there we could have 3,000 repos if we wanted to, with different providers and different implementations and extension mechanisms. I don't know, it's just a thought.
So you're basically saying that what is core versus what is non-core in this case. So it goes back to the original discussion. Is Kubernetes a kernel or is Kubernetes a distribution? I don't think there's a definitive answer on that yet. So I guess that if we ever reach a consensus, then it all makes sense, to move out things
year.
from next year. No, I agree with your sentiment on this. I don't think that at this point there's any push to add friction to the process, because right now we already have the repos, right? So moving those repos out of core or into SIG.case.io, it will be just more work without like a specific benefit if we don't have a roadmap that gets us to, hey, this is going to be core only, and everything non-core is going to be under SIGs. So unless there's a general consensus on that move, I don't think that right now makes sense to make the move without having a general consensus, if we're going to keep Kubernetes as a kernel or if we're going to have Kubernetes as distribution.
Yeah, and I think one of the discussions was like, regardless of whether we want that in SIGs or core, the idea is like, once we get all the providers like in their own repos, then the transition is way easier. Like we just have to change the org and then like we're done. Well, it's not that easy, but like much easier than like going from in-tree to whatever. So
yeah, right. Don't get me wrong. I'm like super happy to see it move out to this separate repo,
right?
Because then it's like that's a great step forward.
Right.
It's like, yeah, then we can actually start thinking about packaging. Now we can't because they're strictly tied coupled to the Kubernetes releases.
Right.
But yeah, it's definitely something we need to, like, for example, discuss in SIG architecture. And when SIG architecture has reviewed some, I don't know, what's needed for this kind of significant kind of stuff, in the end, like KEPs, proposals, design documents, whatnot, and there's a consensus, then it makes sense to move, yes. But I'm just interested and in the discussion, because I think it's gonna be pretty crucial to what Kubernetes looks like to new users and existing ones in the future as we grow exponentially.
Yeah, and I think we're gonna have, I think more members of the SIG is gonna be in KubeCon Seattle too. So I think we'll have a few discussions there as well. Cool. All right, I think we're out of time. So
yeah, right. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks all.